In the first game in the series, BioShock 1, there was a moment where we had a meta commentary on how little agency gamers had. And so the thinking was, how do I get a game that really gives the player a real range of choices while still maintaining really immersive world, really believable, brought to life characters, first person with tons of detail. The honest truth is, I had no idea how we would do that. And so we probably spent just 5 years just even figure out what the hell this was.
Ken Levine, game designer and writer, best known for creating the BioShock series. His work is celebrated for deep storytelling, immersive worlds, and philosophical themes about choice and morality.
One of the things games do amazingly is when you're having a really hard time in your life, people play games, find a place they can go when things aren't so great. Like I always did when I was a kid and when I was lonely, I found a friend in a game. I found a world where I had a little more control, a little more agency, and maybe felt a little more understood.
Hey man, how are you?
Hey Peter, nice to see you.
Yeah, you too, you too. As I was saying just before we kicked off, I spent the morning diving into a lot of the podcasts that you've done recently and a lot of your works. And yeah, I'm really excited for this one. But before we kick off, let's start with a little who you are, what you do and why.
I'm Ken Levine. I'm the president and creative director of Ghost Story Games, and before that, Irrational Games. And we did System Shock 2 was our first game. Then we went on to do a bunch of games like BioShock and then BioShock Infinite. And then I left Irrational and co-founded Ghost Story with a bunch of other guys working on a game called Judas.
Looking at Judas, we'll talk about things like narrative Lego later on, but looking at what I've seen from a trailer perspective and what I've seen slowly coming out, it looks incredible. So I want to dive into the experience though, because obviously it's not been a quick experience. It's a 10-year journey. So yeah, talk to me about that.
When I finished Infinite, there's a moment I was working on the game. And if you remember, there's a companion character named Elizabeth that you spend most of the game with. We really put our heart and soul into making her. And at one point I was like I do a lot of my thinking in the shower or on a run. I think I was on a run or something. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool if Elizabeth could at some point look at what the player did, if the player was overly violent or something, and reject him and say, no, I'm not going on this journey with you. And then I was like, there's no way you can do anything like that. The game is essentially linear for the most part with some few small choices, but it stuck with me. And in the first game in the series, BioShock 1, there was a moment where we had a meta commentary on how little agency gamers had. And I felt, okay, I had made that criticism of my own work. Am I ever going to do anything about it? And so the thinking was, how do I get a game that really gives the player a real range of choices while still maintaining the kind of experience that people expect from us, meaning really immersive world, really believable, brought to life characters, first person with tons of detail. It just hadn't really seen much like that, where not just big branching tree decisions can you make, I'm going to go to the dark side or the light side or whatever, but really much more like life and the interactions you have where small decisions affect people's feelings about you, and people's feelings about you go up and they go down, and sometimes you get really mad and sometimes they come back. And to do that on a really granular level, the honest truth is I had no idea how we're going to do that. So I started thinking of approach. If this gets too nerdy, Peter, at any point, just throw the nerd bell at me. But the way to do it to me was, how do you break the development down so you're working with the smallest possible pieces, the handcrafted pieces, whether that's a piece of furniture or a monster or even a sentence of a dialogue, not a paragraph or a speech. And could you break those things down to their smallest chunk where they maintain their identity, and then teach the game to remix those and put those together in millions of different ways to make a unique experience for every player. And the metaphor we thought of was Lego. Lego is a bunch of pre-crafted, brilliantly crafted pieces that know how to speak to each other. By that, I just mean those little knobs and little holes they have, right? They know how to interact with each other. And we want to do the same thing with a much more complex Lego set, expressing much more complex ideas for our audience. You really don't want them to even think of it as an experiment. That's where the luck we have in the AAA space, the kind of funding we have, is you can try to deliver something experimental, but also doesn't feel like an experiment to the game, but just feels like a different type of game experience they haven't had before.
It was a while ago when you first talked about it at GDC. How has it evolved from that initial speech to where you are today? And also, if you look at things like System Shock 2 to BioShock to Judas, what's the thread that connects them?
I think the thread is they're all first person games, right? One of the reasons I like first person is It's the most experiential you can make it, the most immersive you can make it. Now, you can't make immersive games in other camera views, but I also like how it lets you get so close to the action. Like you can't get closer to the world than in first person. Because if you're in third person, the camera's just pulled back enough. So if there's a book on the table, it's going to be hard for you to get a real good look at that book. Or in first person, you get all that world detail. So I think the continuity is we build a really interesting world that's thought out as any game world could be. And we really spend a lot of time just thinking about how does a society work. And on the ship, it's on the Mayflower, where Judas takes place. It's a strange world where the only thing that matters is the survival of the human species versus the sort of the state of the human species is way less important than just pure survival. And they created a whole society of have and have nots that's based upon how obedient you are to this thing they call the mission, which is doing all of the things which at least one group thinks are necessary for the survival. Other people could think differently, and that's where the conflicts come in. But we've always had a world that was really detailed with really an inherent conflict for you to participate in, really drawn out characters. We were lucky on System Shock 2 at the time. There wasn't a lot of games with very believable human characters, but we have these things called audio logs inherited from the first game. It really allowed us to tell some very human stories and human tragedy. That's always been something really interesting to me because I was at a party once a few years ago. Somebody who worked for me said to me, you know what this country needs, Ken? This country needs a revolution. And I'd studied a lot of revolutions. They're complicated and messy, and sometimes they go reasonably well. Even in the best case, tons of death and destruction. The worst case, things end up worse than where they started. And so I like studying revolution. I like studying collapse of society because then keep your eyes out for it in the real world. But I'm always working in metaphor and we're always working with big characters. And this is a way for us, on top of the sort of modularity for the world building stuff, the ability to have, as I said with the Elizabeth example, different characters who are having very evolving and changing feelings about you over the course of the experience that, as I said, you could damage a relationship, you can try to heal that relationship. But every time you're working for one guy, you're pissing off the other guy. And there's a plate spinning exercise like we do in real life. Like how much time do you spend with your family versus how much time do you spend at work versus how much time do you spend on the team you're playing on. And as you get to be an adult, you realize you can't keep all those plates spinning forever. And some relationships fall aside, and sometimes they fall aside in really dangerous and bad ways. Hopefully not as much in life, but in this game where the stakes are so high. I just wanted to model that human experience. And I wanted these characters to know as much about you as you knew about them. And in most games, the characters, they say their lines, but they don't really reflect on you on a very detailed level. And that was a real key for us to have them really paying attention to you and really evolving their opinions upon you based upon all the small things you do.
So from the evolution of opinion, how does that actually interplay within the game?
You basically make a lot of triggers of the things the player can do that different characters are going to have different feelings about.
Mm.
And they're watching you. And if you have literally hundreds of things you can do that are going to change their feelings about you, you're tracking their feelings about you behind the scene. They're commenting extensively on what you're doing. They're paying attention. They're watching. They're talking about it. And then there are ways they can react on a very increasing scales to show their pleasure or displeasure. And they're pulling from a whole bag of tools. It's not like you complete one question, this happens. It's as you've done. If you could be working for Tom for 3 missions and he's really happy, and then all of a sudden you stop working for him and you start working for Hope because Hope offered you a bribe to go work for her. And this is all happening dynamically, these relationship changes based on what you do. The bribe, she can say, I need you to go do this for me instead. If you do, I'll up the ante by giving you this. And Tom will come in and say, you really don't want to do that. You're really going to piss me off if you do that. And then the third character, Nefertiti, may have an opinion on it. And they're all basically competing for your favor until they get tired of competing for your favor. And that's can happen in dozens and dozens of different ways. It's not like you get to a particular point in the plot and this happens. It can happen across a broad range of things. And eventually one of the characters can get furious at you enough that they never come back and they just make your life a living hell through variety of tools we give them.
It's been a long duration, as in the 10-year. In that regard, I've noticed that you've ultimately had to rebuild an engine and built everything up from the ground up. How did that build process go? How has it come about? What have you learned through that experience? And yeah, like looking at games that really resonate to me, that have an emotional anchor, but there's always a beginning to that anchor. So there's almost a mirror to society that we live in. They're the ones that I really get drawn to. So additionally to the build of everything behind the scenes, where does it all begin for you?
We usually start with, I at least usually start with game design. But System Shock 2 was like, what if we combined first person shooter and RPG? And that was like one of the first games, if not the first game to do that in 99. And then things came from there. We had the world there more or less because it was a sequel to somebody else's game. The BioShock, it was the concept of, they weren't called the Big Daddies and Little Sisters. The Big Daddy and Little Sister, the notion of a protecting creature that wouldn't aggro on you unless you got close to the thing it's protecting. And that came first. And then Infinite was really about a companion character. And this game was really about relationships. But the stuff I talked about in the narrative Lego talk, how can you have these fairly complex relationships based upon a bunch of sliding factors that made a more organic feeling relationship with other characters? Both Infinite and this game, I think, have been super focused on character. And this game times 10, what we did on Infinite, especially in terms of interactive characters that are quite dynamic. Elizabeth's always going to end up in the same place. That's not true in this game with these three characters. So we start with the design. And then with this game, like you mentioned, it's built on top of the Unreal Engine, but it is basically, we don't really have a name for it. I probably should come up with some fancy name for it. The narrative Lego tool set, it's a bunch of acronyms, basically, with all these different systems, the modular environment system, the pacemaker system, the conductor system. There's all these systems under the hood that are interacting with each other to create the experience. So it's quite complicated technologically. One of the biggest challenges at the beginning, if you don't really know the technology, you don't really know the game design and what was the story and how do you write a story for this type of engine, if you want to call it. We didn't know. And we kissed so many frogs along the way. Like we had the character of Judas and the spaceship pretty early on. We knew there was going to be these other major characters. For a while, there was like 9 of them. And then we decided that was just unwieldy. And then we got down to these 3 major characters, sort of 4 major characters you interact with. There's dozens of characters in the game, but these are like the major ones that you're having these relationships with that are highly dynamic. And we didn't know how that worked. Like we didn't know how the relationship was going to evolve. We didn't know what the stakes, the payoffs, how we'd pay off different parts of the relationship. And so we probably spent just 5 years just to even figure out what the hell this was. And because everything had to evolve, we were used to making basically linear games. Like you play BioShock or BioShock Infinite, as wonderful as they look, or even Half-Life or whatever, all these great games, they're really effectively, if you stretch them out, they're basically a corridor, a very long corridor from the start to the end of the game. And there's a bunch of volume triggers you go into, and like a 3D volume, and you go in that trigger, a narrative event will happen. And it will happen the same for you, Peter, the same for me, the same for everybody. And that's what we didn't want to do, not because we've made a bunch of games like that, but how do you tell a story in that environment? What are the payoffs of the leaders either loving you? They could be a big 3 of these characters. The characters have their primary relationship with. What are the stakes? How do they turn against you? What does it mean for them to turn against you? How does this tie into the major story of you being basically the last human being in the universe, orbiting this planet, separated from going down to the planet by this asteroid field? How do these things all tie together? How do we make the world as dynamic as possible? How do we make these characters dynamic as possible? How can we raise the stakes as much as possible? And that was, everything had to work together as the design of the engine evolved, the design of the story and the design of the characters had to evolve. And we made a lot of mistakes along the way. But the good thing is we constantly test the game with both internal and outside testing. And we just see the scores going up and up and up over the time. And I think we've been great at reacting and guessing what people were frustrated with. And by the time you get to the next test, usually those issues have been addressed.
Is there an expectation as to, maybe not an expectation, let's start like actually how the idea came into initial conception. So normally there's a trigger, there's an influence, there's a point of reflection that you come upon when it comes to a story that you want to tell ultimately. Do you remember the first line that you wrote, the influences at that point, and how has that evolved over time?
The first line I wrote for Judas, whether it will appear exactly in the game as it is, but conceptually it's deep run through the game. I was on a run and I came up with this line for the character. Like I didn't really know who she was. We didn't really even know if it was a man or a woman. We just knew there was a personality that I was leading into. That was probably way closer to me than anything I ever wrote before in games. I'm not one of the guys in Freedom Force. I'm not one of the guys in SWAT 4. I'm like a weird, nerdy computer developer, bit of a hermit. And so the first line I wrote is, I like eating at vending machines because I don't have to interact with waiters. All the social cues you have to know, all these small interactions, the smiles, the strange jokes, something along these lines. And it was about somebody who just preferred the company of machines because machines are way less complicated than trying to figure out people. And that led them to have an understanding of machines in depth, and how their relationship with machines is incredibly complicated. So Judas is like sort of a genius engineer, but put it in front of people, it's not great. And I just love that idea for a character. I related to that character because I always, when I was a kid, didn't have really any friends, and my Atari 2600 was my best friend because it was always there and never made fun of me, never judged me if I did terribly at like Circus Atari or something. But it was a constant friend and it was always available. And it made me really maybe have an overly, my life is maybe over machine. I think people can fairly say that. I think that's one of the reasons I got into technology. It was just something I connected to right away. And I just wanted to write a character who, the reason her connection to machines was very emotionally driven rather than she's just genius engineer type. She needs machines. She surrounds herself with machines because that's where she's comfortable. But in a world that's full of robots, it also makes her pretty fucking deadly because she understands them. She knows how to manipulate them. She knows how to control them.
How does it make you feel relating your own experiences directly within a game from an emotional stance? How do you feel about that? And also when it comes to designing decisions that carry emotional weight through the stories that unfold, how do you go about building that and also building consequences back to player resonance? You build affinity with players rather than just time.
I think this is the most emotionally honest game we've ever built. And it's weird. We're not making a game like Life is Strange where it's centered around a lot of quotidian, very slice of life kind of stuff. I think there's supernatural elements there too, but obviously this game, the major characters you're working with are machines, but they think, and everybody else thought they were human and they come off extremely human. So I've distributed a bunch of myself to all these characters, and a lot of the dialogue is written, especially the exploratory dialogue, is not written in front of a word processor. It's written, I'm just often sitting in a chair, recording myself, stream of consciousness. And so a lot of me's coming out into it, just in different ways, filtered. There's no one character who's me, but there's bits of me are filtered out through all the characters. And I'm really trying to write these situations we're dealing with. Like one character is this one robot is, suicidal and has an existential crisis. And another robot is feeling like his life is purposeless and he doesn't know what he's doing and he's falling aside to drink. And another character is obsessed with perfectionism because she had this perfectionist mother. But this is all in the context of a dying spaceship orbiting Proxima Centauri, being battered by asteroids and all these insane robots and technology and weapons going on. And it's interesting. I think we've always tried to bring a little bit more of culture, a little bit of human touch into our games, but always in these fantastical situations. And I really like the merger. Just because your game's on a spaceship doesn't mean all your stakes have to be cosmic. The core content of the game is literally about the survival of the human species or the non-survival of the human species. So the stakes can be higher, but the people are dealing with very broken, normal people who just have these incredible, extraordinary abilities. The flawed heroes, I've always loved that. And as fantastical as this game is emotionally, it's way more grounded than our previous games.
I'm curious, after Infinite, was it a conscious decision that you wanted to make more of these deeper, more emotionally anchored to your own experience type games? Is that one of the founding reasons of Ghost Stories? Was it to give you more freedom in the stories that you can tell? Or I'm just curious as to that kind of journey itself.
The reason I left Irrational and wanted to start something new is I knew that it was going to be a very long period of R&D. And I didn't know how to do that at a company that had 200 people in it. I was going to go start something new. And I just needed the time to focus. I don't think there was I thought I couldn't do it emotionally. It was more, how do we make the player not just an observer, but a participant? That was really the hard part. The sort of thematic sophistication of the audience would be the judge of what we're doing was just, I think it's just been evolving over time. Like the BioShock was, even though there's no character like me in BioShock, the experience of New York in my childhood was so informative for making Rapture. a city that was still in the when I was a kid, it was in the 70s. You still saw the 1950s and the late 40s there, cars and buildings. And now it's evolved somewhat, but it was still the edge of that era. So, in the music and all that stuff. And I knew that world. Infinite was more of a stretch, but I think I just was really interested in building a relationship between two people at the heart of the game, which I'd never done before. And in this game, I was like, I just want to push further and further into character and relationships, especially not when you just watch, but when you really participate in.
Looking at the premise of sequels, what's your view on that? Because when you go so deep into a narrative and tell such a compelling story, your games are consistently rated as some of the highest rated out there. What's your approach to sequels? Is it something that you embrace, or is it just generally where the story leads is where you feel comfortable in following?
I've done, let's see, System Shock 2 as a sequel, and obviously that was first game of my after Thief. It was like the first game that I was a lead on. And I knew that was a blessing because I had this amazing character showdown, and I knew we had to really focus on her because she was so great. And then we did a sequel to Freedom Force. We did a sequel to we did some sequels to other people's stuff, like Tribes and SWAT, which was fine. Those games, I think, especially SWAT, I think worked out really well. And then the next one I did was Infinite. Infinite was weird. I don't think I hadn't done, besides Freedom Force, I hadn't done a sequel to my own game before, our own game. And I had less of a good time working on that. I think the shadow of BioShock was very big. How much should it be like BioShock? How much should it be not be like BioShock? And the brand stood very big. I think that I'm very happy we did it. And I think there's a lot about it I love. But it was trickier for me because the notion of a sequel, what do we need to do? What do we have to do here to make sure this is a BioShock game and honors that? And what can we change? Where in Judas, I've been able to just say, okay, what do we want to do here? And it's both freeing, but it's also scary as shit because you don't have an IP, right? Even in BioShock Infinite, I was like, oh, we're not going to do a rapture. We're going to do a totally different place. But there were themes that got exposed during the course of the game that were very much BioShock. We're here, we're not bound by any of that. But I think I'm not going to lie. Obviously, I have a style that I like working in, and you could see probably like a guy like Wes Anderson or Scorsese, somebody who's got a very particular visual style, pacing style or thematic style. Scorsese's always analyzing complex micro societies, and whether that's the mob or whether it's high society in the turn of the century New York. He's always going to be studying society. Wes Anderson is often going to do family stories, but in this extremely stylized approach. I'd like a bit of exaggeration in my visuals, mostly because it helps things read much better when you're sitting on a 24-inch monitor or whatever, sitting on the couch. I like telling stories of societies because there's so much you can do there, make the world believable. I definitely have a style, but there was nothing I was bound to because there was an expectation of a sequel.
From a style perspective, you can see that if you go hyper realism versus the style that you've embraced, your style generally passes the test of time. I was playing BioShock, the original, just the other day, just to redraw my memory on it. And yeah, it still plays really nice. And from a look and feel perspective, it doesn't need that level of hyper realism because it's the story that holds the strength.
It's a real challenge, I think, with hyper realistic games because you're really dependent upon the bells and whistles to look better than the last hyper realistic game. Or if you choose your own aesthetic, and again, I think probably Judas is closer to realism than our previous games, somewhat. I mean, there's definitely more effect. The society is really weird and fantastical, but the sort of rendering of the characters is probably closer to realistic, but it's still exaggerated somewhat. We found, like we said, I've often heard people say BioShock still looks good, and I think it's exactly that. You're not going to notice that the exact specular highlighting or whatever is not nearly as good as what they have now because we're not really dependent upon the technology. And so therefore, I think you can go back and look, probably even go back to like System Shock 2, the remaster just came out. It's probably gonna look better than a remaster of a super realistic looking game at the time of Rainbow Six, say the original Rainbow Six, because they were trying to target something that was you can really compare and contrast to reality in a way that's harder to do when you're doing more exaggerated work.
Just to go back 2 points, actually. Firstly, you talked about the larger studio base that you separated from to go down the route of Ghost now. Looking at the news at the moment, what's your take on the acquisition of EA? Looking at the amount of money that's been spent, I think from that 55 billion, there's going to be about 20 billion that's going to go directly onto the books as debt. How do you think that'll play out? And why do you think that move? And also, you look at the opposite side and you've got Ubisoft there with a market cap of 1.4 billion. They've got some rich IP, but again, decisions for people not to acquire it, and for things like Tencent, for example, to back directly Assassin's Creed as an IP rather than an overarching studio base. I'm just curious to gauge your viewpoint as to the current sphere of the games industry at the moment.
This is going to sound, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. The only constant is change, right? I remember when we started, we were a PC game development studio. That's all we knew. And that's all. I wasn't really a console gamer outside of, I played on them all. I played the NES. I guess I'm not a console gamer. And I had an NES, a Sega Master System, an Atari, N64. I pretty much had all of them. But I think if I had a platform of choice, it was PC, mostly because people really hadn't figured out how to do like first person shooters and stuff like that, and strategy games, genres I loved on the console. People don't remember, before Steam, the PC market was dying. Like the retailers, you had to go buy games at retail, and the retailers just stopped carrying them. They wouldn't give them shelf space. And it was basically a death sentence. And we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And I guess we got to make console games, got to figure that out. And that wasn't easy. We started one and it didn't go very well. Game we never shipped. And we learned a lot, but we had to pivot the company to doing console games. And in fact, BioShock 1 was our first console game that we shipped. And we figured it out. We sold the company to Take-Two. We saw that keeping independent studios going at that point was really rough because you didn't really have Steam to directly deal with your audience. We still had to go through publishers, and those publisher deals were really brutal. We survived. We had a publisher who got really mad because we sued them because they were claiming they owned Freedom Force and they didn't. And we had to sue them and win our own rights back. And they sued us for something else, which we also won. There's so many times we almost got destroyed. So every time we look at what's going on, whether you're running a company or a game industry developer, you have to say, where's the ball going? And sometimes the ball goes to good places, sometimes it goes to bad places. But in 30 years of doing this, actually it's 30 years this month, everything changes. And technology changes, business changes. And I still think there's opportunities to make great games. Sometimes it gets trickier. Sometimes you think things are gone like PC games, and then they come back and they're probably going to be the dominant gaming form outside of mobile. But those are really a different type of gaming experience. But the kind of games I love are really mostly going to be on PC, I think. So it's funny. You think things are changing, you think the world is gone, and then it does change and it comes back. It's harder without the perspective. I've been doing it 30 years, and you see a lot of things, and you remember all the times you panicked, and you just got to figure out the world's going to change. What am I going to do to keep up?
People don't see the benefit of looking backwards into the lessons that can be drawn from history. We always go through the ebbs and flows. You look at the various different models that we have at this moment in time and the rationale behind some of these M&As. I'm very much in the same camp as you. I'm story and narrative driven. I look at things like the live service model, and I think that people are tiresome in regards to microtransactions, and also look at the volume of games that are coming out on Steam. Discoverability is an issue. And then you look at that underserved mid-core audience base and go, actually, there's a player base there that are really intrigued in the depth of story that could be told, and you look at the possibilities of interwoven narratives and the transmedia journey, then yeah, again, like it's not necessarily a defined pathway, but it's more a pathway that you want to choose and persist with that.
Yeah, I would say like console games actually became more like PC games over time. You think about it, you look at complexity and the fact that you can play like a Cyberpunk on a console. So I feel like sometimes it feels really scary. One of the reasons I was terrified when PC games were going out in the early 2000s, not just for my own business, the type of games I love to play. It forced us to innovate, right? It forced us to bring BioShock to a console, right? Where System Shock 2 never had that challenge. And how do we keep the kind of things people love about our games, but lean into the platform? Over time, you've seen they're becoming more similar, and the amount of depth people will accept in games has gone way up. The PC market has changed the console market more than the console market has changed the PC market. And that's why I think probably you're going to see more dominance on the console side, on the PC side. over time. But I think it's scary. Look, I won't lie to you. Big change is scary. It happens, right? So what are you going to do? You know, curse the
Yes.
darkness to light a candle, and lighting a candle sucks sometimes, but the only way to go forward is to see where you're going.
Just to touch on influences, because again, like the games that you're known for, there is a very clear style and aesthetic. We talked a little bit earlier about Anderson, but I'm also interested in your other influences. I've heard you talk about the Coen brothers and also series like Mad Men. Like from a wider sphere of influence, what are the things that have influenced you the most into the experiences and games that you've created?
I'd say probably my overall biggest influence is Orwell, his understanding of politics and manipulation of society. And he had such an interesting experience. People don't know that much about him. They think he was just a writer. Orwell started as a sort of servant of the empire, working in parts of the British Empire. He got really turned off by that and became a socialist, hardcore socialist. Then he went to fight the fascists in Spain. And then he was not only horribly wounded, he was shot through the neck, which probably led to his eventual death. But then he was almost murdered by the Soviets because there was interfactional fighting amongst the anti-fascist side. The rise of the Soviet Union, despite his strong socialist beliefs, showed him what could happen in an authoritarian society. If you read 1984, it's a warning about authoritarianism. And in that case, it's a socialist setting. But I think what he's saying is any sort of power structure can spin out of control. Doesn't matter if it's left or right. Authoritarianism is a shared evil of any potential political movement. And that's the danger, really, is authoritarianism. And he was able to dissect in Animal Farm what happens when the revolutionaries become the powerful. The pigs start becoming like the people they revolted against and treated the other animals like the farmers did. The pigs basically became the farmers. And this his commentary on a lot of some revolutionary movements, specifically he was looking at the Soviets in that case. But then he really dug into how does an authoritarian system sustain itself? And that was 1984. And it's still probably the go-to book to understand the nature of media and its ability to control and the state to control people and keep them locked in this horrible system, and just even to be able to change the nature of reality from day to day by retconning in. The term didn't even exist, but we've always been at war with Oceania. So if you know the term from the book, they're always changing whoever they're allied with. There's wars going on. They just constantly changing who they're allied with, and they just pretend they've always been their friend, and the other side's always been the enemy. And they just retcon these histories into people, and they take the elements out of the newspaper that are no longer comfortable. And it's given his experience, his understanding of how media works, his understanding how government works, his personal experience combined to really make him second to none. But there's a bunch of other books. I think if you look at Judas, probably Huxley and Brave New World, it's much more of a benign autocracy. Feels more about keeping people happy rather than keeping them immiserated. But there's still an outgroup that is kept immiserated because you always need an outgroup to hate. Another book is a great book if you want to understand the nature of fast movements, whether they're left or right, is The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. He was a dock worker in the 1950s, not an academic, and he wrote an incredible book about the shared nature of all mass movements throughout history and the kind of people get attracted to them. And you read it and you look at what's going on even today, and you can't help but recognize this commonalities. But that's the sort of more intellectualized stuff. But in terms of film, it's P.T. Anderson and Wes Anderson and Tarantino and Spielberg, and there's so many Coen brothers. They got to get back together. Please get back together. I like people who break the rules. I like people who don't have to they're so good they don't have to follow the structure. Most movies are very rigid 3-act structures. Those guys tend to write episodic movies. They tend to they're not bound to reality 100%. Generally, they're able to push it. Really, when they need to be realistic, like No Country for Old Men, boy, they can do it like nobody's business. But then they'll do the Hudsucker Proxy and really push reality, or Miller's Crossing, which sort of sits on the edge of reality, or Fargo. They're very comfortable in all kinds of spaces, but it's always a Coen Brothers film.
What games and I guess also movie streaming, watching or playing now, what are you enjoying?
Just watch Weapons, which I thought was really, certainly the first two thirds of it
Yeah, it's a
was
good one.
great. As watching it, I'm thinking like, this is if P.T. Anderson made a horror movie. And then I read an interview with him and he said Magnolia, P.T. Anderson,
Yeah.
Magnolia was a huge influence for him
Mm.
because it was so character driven and usually horror movies aren't. The third act, it loses that a bit. It becomes more of a typical horror movie, but I tend to like very character driven stuff. I love Hereditary is one of my favorite films of all time, and it's a hard watch. But if you had a complicated relationship with your mom, it's an interesting movie to watch because it's really a metaphor. Like I think the best horror is usually a metaphor for other things. The Shining was, especially the book, if you read it, is really a metaphor about his collapse and King's own alcoholism.
Yeah.
And it's really a destruction of, it's really a horror story, but a story about a breakdown of a family. Judas has a lot of similarities in the sense that it's really about a breakdown of a family. These three characters you're interacting with are a family. Their family has been broken apart for political reasons, essentially, but they still love each other and it's complicated. The themes of mixing horror and science fiction, in our case, science fiction, with really grounded stuff that people can relate to, I think is very powerful. And I tend to like type of stories. Like Wes Anderson's best film, I think is probably The Royal Tenenbaums because it really deals with that
Yeah,
family dynamic incredibly well.
Yeah, I think that emotional imperative is really key. It's more so, I guess, being curious. The thing that I've always liked about your games is you pose interesting questions without telling people what they should be expected to feel. I think that's important. And you talk about the family dynamics. That's what I'm really curious about now in regards to the whole political sphere. Like some people are on one side, some people on the other. You reference books. There's a great one by a guy called Moses Naim called The Revenge of Power. And he talks about populism, polarization, and post truth. Honestly, I'm curious when it comes to reading. So I think there's a lot to be framed within there. I'm obviously from the north of England. We have this whole thing called the Red Wall between those in the south versus those in the north. It's an older book, but again, some great insight there. And I'm drawn, from my perspective, I like the premise of pain plus reflection equals progress. That whole ability to draw learnings from trauma, and that you can't beat books like Viktor Frankl's One Sense of Meaning. I think that there's a lot to be captured in there. But I guess like looking at games, looking at entertainment properties, I think the feeling matters more than the feature. But from your perspective, why do you want to tell those stories? Why do you think it's important to cut through the noise that we see within society today? And why do you want to pose those more interesting questions to an audience based and say, follow the route of The Last of Us and focus solely on the premise of love, for example?
I was very fortunate when I was a kid that my mom was very interested in my intellectual development. And I remember several things that happened along the way where she once told me, when you're a kid, at least for me, when I read a book, that was a major effort. I didn't read a lot when I was a kid or read
Yeah.
comic books. And then you read a whole book about something and you assume, man, I read that whole book. It's got to be true. And back then, especially, there was just like 3 TV stations and there was the news, right? Mom said to me when I was probably about 8 or 9, Kenny, just because it's in a book or just because it's on TV doesn't mean it's true. And she wasn't being conspiratorial. She was just saying, make up your own mind, do your research, make up your own mind. And so I'm very proud that when we make a game, BioShock, obviously you can take us a substantial critique of objective Ayn Rand and objectivism, but every objectivist I've ever met likes it because my goal wasn't to go say, this is bad. My goal was to say, here's a guy and here's why he ended up this way. His family was destroyed by the Bolshevik Revolution. He was terrified that the Bolshevik come to his door because of his very particular experience in his life. And so much that he basically, even though he moved to America, he had to leave because he saw it happening again, his trauma coming back.
Yeah.
And he makes Rapture. And then it's about the extreme he went to, that it had to be extreme, that the ideology leads. Even though reality is telling your ideology isn't quite working out 100%, maybe you should moderate a bit or rethink. And he even has some moments where you see him almost rethinking. And then he's like, no, the kids must be wrong, if you know the meme. But he can't learn from reality, and that's his tragedy. And I think that's a tragedy often happens. People have ideological beliefs, and they read it in a book. But the problem is, when I was writing BioShock, it was very much, what if instead of the characters Rand put in this objectivist story, like an Atlas Shrugged type story, what if I put people much more like people I know? I never met a person like a Randian hero. Look, I wish I was as cool as a Randian hero. Incredibly handsome, chiseled jaw, completely dedicated to his ideology, and the ideology in the end works out because it's Rand's novel. Whatever ideology I'm writing about, I'm always interested in the delta from what's on paper from what plays out in reality. And I think that's a real problem. Whether you're on the left or the right, I think people get these ideological beliefs and then they become rigid. And then when reality doesn't play out that way, instead of realizing that you have to deal with reality, they just blame reality. People are complicated. People are messy. We don't come from angels. We come from animals. We're barely evolved animals and we're messy and we're complicated. And the best ideological structures take that into account. Like I think the separation of powers in the United States is one of the most brilliant inventions, political inventions of all time, because it implies a certain distrust of human nature that is healthy, which if you give anybody too much power, they can make very bad things happen.
In itself, that leads to inherent fears. And both the creative process and your approach to storytelling, what elements of that scare you, bearing in mind the volume of games that you've shipped and also the influences that you have?
What do you mean by scare?
Often when it comes to storytelling, at least my approach to it, it comes down to influences that you see externally. So I look at this world that we live in now, and for me, that's a bit scary, but there's an opportunity there in regards to moving people. And again, if I'm looking at the media of games, it's not necessarily to say that this should be happening. It's more so to pivot against that fear by opening up opportunities to talk in a deeper, more view perspective. But again, is fear part of your creative process? And if so, how?
Certainly, I agree with you that the world is more like the worlds I write about than it was when I was writing about them. It's catching up a bit. The divisiveness, the sort of polar tensions of extremes pushing against everybody in the middle. And I've written about that for a long time. BioShock, you have extremes of a fairly cynical movement by Fontaine versus Ryan, who had his own problems and everybody. One of my favorite stories in BioShock is of the woman whose daughter becomes a little sister, and you follow her journey and she's just trying to get by in Rapture and she's crushed by the larger forces around her. I definitely think that we live in a much more ideological time than I remember ever in my life. I feel bad for young people because they came up in this time, combination of COVID and a combination of sort of political polarization. And I think that it's very easy to get super enthusiastic about politics until you know the terrible things that politics can do. And I really believe that we're way more like each other than we are different. It's weird to be in a time where you see that creeping sense of political conflict coming into both your country and my country. People often ask me, like, well, are your games political? And obviously, our games have strong political themes. There's a view that all art is political. And I'm sorry, I don't think Mario 64 is particularly political. And if all art's political, then no art's political. So I have no problem talking about our games in terms of how they view politics and how they interact with politics. I think there is an extreme version where every game has to have this responsibility to say something. And that's just not what every game is. In fact, if every game was that, it'd be really exhausting. And people need an escape. They need a way to refresh their brain so they can come back to the problem set refreshed. The same way they need vacations from work, they need vacations from reality. And that's why I've never really tried to talk about specific political moments of the current day in our games, but we talk about things that are much more universal and have been happening probably since the dawn of time.
From your perspective, the premise of telling a story within gaming, and it gives players escape, does it give you escape as well?
Yeah, certainly. I know that in the past couple of years, once the game gets to a certain point, the writing gets a lot easier because you know the characters well enough, they really just start speaking to you and they start writing themselves. And things that were very simplistic and very characters say something to advance a plot becomes much more robust. I'm able to really tune into the characters, whether it's Judas, the main character, or Tom, or Hope and Nefertiti, who are the big three you interact with. I know them so well. To go there is a real relief from the world. You can probably tell from what I've written, I pay a lot of attention to what goes on. It's the best of my ability. And it can get exhausting. It could be depressing. It could be scary. And the nice thing about the world, even writing about worlds that are even way more fucked up than our world, is there's a certain degree of control I have. I admire writers such as Orwell because I think he was able to influence how we think about political communication, how we think about authoritarianism. I don't know if our games have done any of that. Certainly, I see people who love our games. The next time there's a big propaganda push from one side or the other, they tend to go all in, even though they seem to take the lessons of our game on board when they were created. But look, it's difficult. The world is an extremely complicated place. And especially when you're young, it could feel so overwhelming. It feels so new. And it's hard to see the patterns of history. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think that's pretty true.
Looking at the development cycle of Judas, for example, because it's been quite a long duration of time thus far, as we touched on earlier, the rationale as to why it's taken so long in regards to the build process and what you've had to build in the background and allowing the time to breathe and a narrative to be nurtured. Was there a moment during that process that you've thought, yeah, I'm a bit lost here, or maybe you wanted to pull back from the narrative that you're telling?
I think for the first 5 or 6 years, we were pretty lost, and we knew that we have these. We didn't really know who the characters were. They've all changed pretty substantially outside of Judas. They've all really changed. Like Tom was very different. These are the big three of the main characters, three biggest main characters to interact with. Nefertiti was the same, but not really. And Hope was extremely different. She was a character called Cleopatra for a while. I mean, she was a totally different character. We had additional characters that we cut out of the game and added different characters. So as we start to understand the game design, how the narrative Lego thing really worked, how our engine built on top of the Unreal Engine sort of worked, it told us a lot about how you'd be interacting with these characters. But also, as I got to know them, the character stories went from more political to more personal. I really know these people, and I know their pain and I know their joy and I know their problems, that I know about their childhood. I know pretty much everything about them. And I have a great writing team I work with who's just amazing. And we always get together in the writer's room and we talk things through pretty much every day. There's just been amazing conversations where we take these big, complicated themes. I think what I've always tried to do is take big, complicated themes and make them extremely accessible. If I were to tell you before BioShock, oh, we're making a game that deals with Ayn Rand's objectivism, you'd probably be like, oh, that sounds really boring. But you find ways to make it. We never forget that I'm making a game at the end of the day. We're making a game that has to entertain people. So we are able to take these sort of political themes and exaggerate them and turn them away from, we're never trying to capture this thing from the current moment. We're really universal themes, but I think as I've gotten to know the characters, they don't just embody some of the sort of political themes. They just became much more complex individuals themselves.
From a story perspective, from a storied world side, like the games that you've been notorious for are like really well rounded. But when I'm looking at character perspective, do you start there or do you start with the world build first? Where's your normal approach when it comes to coming up with new IP?
We start with design, as I said, like with BioShock, it was with little sister and the big daddy. Oh, not even them specifically. Just a character who protects another character, and other characters you're trying to kill the protected character. That was the first idea. BioShock Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite was a companion character. And it was the player having a really in-depth interaction, a set of characters the relationship would evolve in extremely complex ways. Once we knew that, it was, okay, who are these characters? We really wanted them to be very different from each other. It took us a while to figure out they were a family broken up by this political conflict. I'm sure we all can relate to sometimes politics coming into our family and causing tension. You guys don't have Thanksgiving there, but we have the classic notion of Thanksgiving dinner, and some kid in college is arguing with his uncle who's got different political views, and it's become more and more, certainly in the last few years, I think. But a family who's both broken up ideologically, but also broken up as a family. And you're, as Judas, trying to interact with these three, also learning about their connection to each other. They're not just the warlord, blah, 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 and the queen, blah, blah, blah. These are people who really know each other. And unlike early games, you were born in Judas. Judas was born on the ship. We don't have the advantage of bringing the player and the character into contact with the world at the same time. Judas has been there the whole time. So we do a whole bunch of things, like your whole backstory is told through a series of missions that you actually go through in first person. You just read about it, hear about it, you actually experience them. And then you go through the front story, where the ship is now. But I've just loved both creating these characters with the writing team and then working on these characters with this incredible cast we have they're so patient. Most of them have been on this game for quite a time, way more than they would on most games. But we're also really trying to reward that. But a lot of times you hear from voice actors and they show up in the writing session. They just get their sides and they're just their lines. They don't know anything about the game. They don't know anything about the story. We actually send the writer's scripts ahead of time. We have opportunities for the writers to play the game. We really brief them because the more they know, the better they can do. That's just true about ours. And we just have such a great cast that I've been really blessed.
Yeah, I remember the guys behind Red Dead Redemption 2. You see them on YouTube all the time talking about the extended duration of time that they went through that, like years in the making. But ultimately, the experience that they got, the connection they formed with the character, and yeah, the emotional anchoring as well that comes from that. To me, it created a better experience because, again, when you saw some of these elements play out, yeah, like you felt it in their voice, you felt it in how it's portrayed. I think it brings more to the experience as well. When it comes to the complexities of the stories that you map out, what's influencing you there? I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan, so I look at how he approached narrative, especially around Memento with that hairpin loop. The ability to bounce back and forth to ultimately lead to a very clear and well-formed end that kind of allowed the viewer to go on that journey with him. That's an influence for me. And when it comes to telling complex narratives, what influences you and how do you break it down?
It's hard because games are really different than movies. Like a movie, you can literally sit there and say, okay, I'm going to literally point your head where I want it to look. And the audiences, they're not a participant. Sorry, that's not true. The audience is a participant in a movie. I do think every movie, every piece of art doesn't stand on its own. Every piece of art is formed by the interaction of the audience and the art, right? Whether it's a painting or a movie. However, at games, you're not just a sort of passive interaction. You're, especially in this game where you really decide what Judas is doing. You really decide there's so many decisions you have to make, and all those decisions have consequences. And the world will change substantially based upon what you do, and these relationships will change. There's nothing like it. And I don't think anybody's tried to build this complicated, not even complicated, this rich and complex a character study, both of her and the other characters' room, while leaving the door open for a massive amount of interactivity. I'm so appreciative to Take-Two because they were willing to fund. At the beginning, it was an experiment. Now we've been testing it and it's demonstrating people get it and it works. The amount of depth, the audience, as long as you titrate it in properly, the amount of depth an audience can take on in a game, much more on a novelistic level than a movie level. Movies are pretty simple. They're 120 minutes. There's 3 acts generally. There's characters you're following. And that's just a function of medium. Some movies are quite complex, and those tend to be the movies I love. But this game is more of a novelistic scale of depth to make that accessible to people so they feel they're engaged. Because look, it's not when you read a novel, you've got 100% of their attention on the story and the characters. I have this term player RAM. That's how much memory the player has. About 60% of your RAM is just taken up by navigating a first person character in the space. It's a huge amount of attention that it takes up. And people have developed more RAM over time once they learned how to use a controller or a first person shooter. Once they got comfortable with that, they free up some RAM for some other things. But as time has gone on, games got more deep and more interesting, I think. And we're just trying to push that as far as we can so they can really engage in this world as much as they want to. I'm pretty strange, Peter. I'm not actually a huge story gamer. I tend to like games where I tend to like running around, escapism, shooting things, exploring places. I mostly don't pay attention to the story beats. And I think I try to make a story game for people like me. For people, if they want to, they can pretty much ignore a lot of things in their previous games too. If you want to ignore in BioShock all the audio logs and all the exploration, you discover details about the world, you can. You'll just get a lot more out of the game if you do, but you'll still have a cool experience. We're not a walking simulator or a narrative reading game. We are trying to bring this kind of character depth and world depth to a much more accessible place where a huge amount of gamers can really experience and start to appreciate the ability to express their will in a really amazing space like the Mayflower and really choose, who am I befriending? What's my path? What are the moral decisions I'm making? Who am I? Which Judas am I?
I'm intrigued as well. Like, what excites you most about this project? You mentioned you've been in the industry for about 30 years now. So what keeps the faith?
Challenge. Every IP I've ever built has had at least one sequel, if not more. Thief. Sister Shock was a sequel. There actually has not been a sister, but I didn't build that IP. Thief, Freedom Force, Shock, and we'll see about Judas have had sequels. Every IP I built because I think I try to really flesh out the IP as much as you can, so you feel there's more off the edge of the frame than you can see. Keys to faith is I still think the games industry is at a very early stage. If you look at the movies, 30s and 40s, they were getting what a movie was, and it evolved. But generally, how many genres out there? How many you look at, like, what exactly is this? And I think we were getting stuck for a while where we have first person shooters, we have MMORPGs, but now you play tons of games, whether it's Dave the Diver or Balatro or whatever, they're indie people are coming in and saying, we're experimenting, and we're experimenting not to make weird, inaccessible things. We're experimenting with really fun things, but nothing you've seen before. And AAA struggles with that because it's so expensive, right? To build games with this production values. I'm very lucky that I get to experiment and make something new with the production values of a AAA game at this stage of my career. And that's what keeps me coming back every day. It's not what I know, it's what I don't know that keeps me interested. It's the problems I have to solve, the problem I have to solve with the team. That's what keeps me going because it's like a puzzle. It's no job and then to come in every day and try to solve puzzles. And that's what game development is. We don't really know the final form yet. And there's not a lot of, like when you work in film, I've worked in film, I've written for Warner Brothers, I've written for Paramount. There's often an executive who comes in who tells you, okay, if you don't hit act 2 by page 31, nothing like that in games. We're still figuring it out every day. And I just love being part of that. I'd much rather be in the early stages than the end stages of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that whole unknowing piece as well. What's your viewpoints in regards to the players? Because obviously the whole kind of Q&A and R&D process that you've done around Judas in regards to having people engaged, to seek feedback, to iterate on the basis of that, I can imagine can only be a rich experience. But looking externally, do you think players actually want to know what your game is going to be about? And I guess also in the deeper meaning, what it says about themselves?
I think the worst way to learn about what the game should be is listen to me, right? Game doesn't exist on its own. It's an intersection of the viewer and the game, or in a game, not just the viewer, the participator, gamer. And I don't really believe that any game, there's this term authorial intent. I've never believed in it, that the game is what Ken says it is, or the team says it is. The game is what you're experiencing. One day I'm not going to be around. And if I'm fortunate and people are still playing the games, I'm not going to be around to ask. And just the way when you encounter any things that would be, whether that's Hemingway or Dickens or whatever, you have to make your understanding of it on your own with the book or with the work. And I think that's the way it should be. I'm really never here to tell people. I don't really try to explain a lot of the mysteries of the game. You won't see me out saying, oh, no, this is what this means. Why would I want to take that joy away from the gamer? Maybe they come up with something way cooler than what I had in mind. So I always welcome that.
Yeah, I think it's about posing interesting questions rather than definitive answers and letting people experience, like what you said about Dickens and such. You can pick that up at that one stage, depending how you feel at that point of time may differentiate versus how you feel at another point in time. And that's the beauty of art, right? It's changeable.
Yep. Yep.
I can't help but ask, but is there an image or something that haunts you from these 30 years, something that you wish you'd done within a game or a narrative choice or the studios that you worked within that you maybe not necessarily a regret, but harker back you wish you could have done?
Dude, I've been so lucky. I've not had a career where it's okay, you're going to work on successful game number 19, like the 19th iteration. The thing that's most I've been fortunate about is I get to work on our intellectual property and develop new intellectual property. That is both the most terrifying thing to do and the most exciting thing to do, because when you work on somebody else's intellectual property, unless you're doing it wrong, you really need to work within the constraints of that property and really respect it. I think I've done it well. At times, System Shock 2, I think we did a really good job of respecting what System Shock was. And then a game like Tribes Vengeance, and I've said this before, I don't think we did a great job of understanding Tribes Vengeance. At least I didn't as the writer on it. I think the team did a much better job than I did. And I was fighting against it, but it was a job we needed as a studio. This is during these lawsuits I told you about. We needed money to survive. It was brutal. But I also thought I wasn't a great friend to that Tribes community who really wanted a Tribes game that really honored what they love about Tribes. And so since then, have not had to work on anybody else's intellectual property. And I get to build things with my team and explore the meaning of what they are without having to worry about alienating people who've been attached to this thing for a very long time. I think there is a responsibility that comes with taking on somebody else's IP, treating it with respect, and treating the audience with respect. If you don't respect your audience, if you have hostility towards your audience, you're never going to succeed, especially with an existing IP. But when you're making a new IP, you're taking that scary risk of, hey, is anybody going to like it? Would have been much easier probably to take on another BioShock game in terms of marketing and PR. Walking away from that, we knew what it meant to walk away from a really successful IP. It could mean you're never going to make another successful IP again. But I believe we put enough love, care, and uniqueness into Judas that it's going to be something people get attached to, but you never know. And that's a big risk. But I guess I'd rather take that risk than just be so afraid to do something different that you get stuck.
Yeah, definitely. The easy path would have been just to continue on, but there's no better place than to be in that area of fear and risk. You mentioned about quality, especially the bigger budgets. Sadly, there's been a shift more towards how much money can we earn on this rather than how much quality can we provide to the community? How can we elevate an industry?
I get these pressures because look, game development is really expensive, and we're in
Yeah.
a place where we can build a game that doesn't have to rely upon live services. It doesn't have to rely upon free to play and buying, encouraging people to either pay to win or selling them cosmetics and things like that. We're really able to make a very old school game that you buy for a certain price and you get the game and you get to play it.
What's your viewpoint? I know we touched upon it earlier about transmedia, but what's your viewpoint in regards to like games as a source? Now, so many are going down the route of adaptation. We've seen like one of my favorites, anyways. I've mentioned The Last of Us so many times in this podcast, but one of my favorites as well is like what the adaptation they did around Fallout. I thought that was like absolutely incredible. But again, like it seems games are quite quickly becoming the source. So I guess what do you feel Hollywood especially could learn from the way you approach world building?
Fallout, they didn't really take a story from Fallout as much as they took the world building from Fallout. And they really respected it and they really leaned into it. Even the way the combats and the show work felt very much like the pause time combat you had in the game. All the aesthetics were there. The sort of bit of goofiness in a good way was there. They really respected it, but also keeping the real stakes. Where Last of Us, say, it was a much more, at least season one was a much more note for note adaptation, but Last of Us was written that way. It was written to be, a lot of it was cutscenes, right? It was very specific characters and very specific conflicts, unlike Fallout, which is really about you put yourself into this world. So in Fallout, they adopted the world. And Last of Us in the first season, they adopted the story. And I thought they both worked well doing that because Neil knows how to write a very compelling story, and the Fallout guys know how to build a very compelling world. A lot of directors, and I totally get this, it's very hard to get a big movie made without an intellectual property attached. So what often happens is you talk to a big director about something, and they have a vision of a movie that they want to make that has some overlap with what you're doing, but they really just want to make their movie, which I get as a creator. Like I said, I don't love working on other people's intellectual properties. I'm sure they're the same, right? They want to make their own vision, but that's a tension, right? If they don't love the thing that they're trying to adapt, it's going to fight against it. And maybe you end up with something good, but generally, I think you see the reaction to the game adaptations when the creators of the show or the movie really get the source material. Whether it's Last of Us season one or Fallout season one, there's such an understanding of the material that really works. And if you try to fight against it, people probably aren't going to care.
Yeah, definitely. What adaptation would you like to see from books, games, creative that you've come across?
It'd be nice if something got adapted and eventually made a screen, whether it's Thief or BioShock or Judas. It is hard to do right. And so I don't really think about it a lot. I used to think more about it because having gone through the experience of trying to get it, I'm not involved in the current BioShock movie and I haven't been tuned in, but they may be making something absolutely great. I don't know. I'm just not involved with it. Having been through the experience of the things I talked about, working with filmmakers who want to make their own thing, it's just hard to get it right. I think Hollywood's getting better about understanding. I think they didn't really, often you meet with executives like, my son plays some of your games versus somebody who comes to you like, I want to make this thing because I get it. I see. And that's pretty rare to find. So I don't think a ton about it. If it happens, if it doesn't happen, that's fine too.
I feel anyways, it might just be my own opinion, apart from a few select movies and shows, the depth of emotion and the risks that people are willing to take creatively. What do you think that big studios and Hollywood are doing wrong in those areas versus what you've traditionally done so well?
But they're in a hard spot. The theater business has really declined. They've painted themselves in a corner with a lot of these streaming services. Only one of them has really been super successful, which is Netflix. They train people to not go to the movies. And I certainly got trained that way. Do I want to go to the movies and deal with all that crap? Or do I want to watch my giant 50-inch screen with my sound bar and all this amazing stuff? I think it's hard, though. Art is a very hard business and always will be a hard business. And to do it right requires just a real attention to both your craft, but also an understanding of where the audience is at and meet the audience.
You mentioned earlier the element about Judas is probably the truest reflection of yourself. What part do you see most clearly in Judas?
I understand things, and whether those things are stories or computers or political systems better than individual people and struggles with people in a way that I do, but also, well, she's way more brilliant than I am. She's got like 30 IQ points on me, which is always interesting to write somebody much smarter than yourself. But she also struggles to, I've never been one at going alone to get along. I was the kid who hated walking in line. I was hated sing-alongs. I was the kid who hated any group activity like that required you to subsume yourself in a part of a group, like wearing uniforms. Like I lasted like 2 weeks in the Cub Scouts because it was all about being part of this thing. I was always pretty individualistic, and Judas is the same way, not always to her benefit. And it was really interesting around a character that's more close to myself and struggles with some things I can. I'm not sure Judas would be great at leading a giant piece of software development, over 10 years. I'm a little better. I think I've been a little better at it, but that's only because I've learned through very painful experience about how to be better as a leader over the years than I was when I started.
How do you feel if Judas ended up being your last game you ever made? What would you wanted to say about you, and what would you want the audience to feel and experience if it potentially was your last game?
I never really think about that. I just want to make something that people are it's going to be meaningful to them. I don't care how it's meaningful to them. I don't care what they take away from it. I care that they engage with it and it means something in their life. And I'm very fortunate. I have a lot of people contact me and say, one of the things games do amazingly is when you're having a really hard time in your life, we're a place to go. And for me, I'm lucky. Both games are a place to go for me as a gamer, but also as a creator. I'm having a really bad day and I go on the game and all of a sudden I'm in a different world. If I can do that, I don't really need anything else. If I can give people a place to go and a place to hide out, man, I'm happy.
Yeah, man. Honestly, I can talk to you all day. These are the conversations that I really value, and thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Just to close out, what would your closing thought be to our audience? Like a key takeaway, what would you like to leave with them?
My ambitions are pretty small. I want to be able to continue to make games until they drag me out of here. And I incredibly value that people play the games, not only enjoy them, but find a place they can go when things aren't so great. Like I always did when I was a kid and when I was lonely, I found a friend in a game. I found a world where I had a little more control, a little more agency, and maybe felt a little more understood.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, Ken.
Thank you, Peter. I really enjoyed it.